Okay, welcome back to another episode of Pacific Legends.
Unleashed.
Mate, it's been a while since the last one, eh?
It's been a bloody long time.
What's happened?
We've been flat out.
We've gone off the boil.
I was teaching, you were teaching,
Yeah, we were researching
played
for
some
the pod.
pickleball.
I was thinking more it just takes a long time to read a book these days, isn't it?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
My attention span is non-existent.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But anyway, apologies for the delay, but we're back
yeah.
with some stories
In a
from
very
Vietnam.
mediocre way. Yeah, our first episode was a pretty quick-fire rundown of Vietnam's history and of Cold War history in general. You gave us some good hard-hitting facts
Facts!
about the Cold War, the parallels between
Parallels.
Korea 50 and 53 and
Yeah.
what would happen in Vietnam. You talked a bit about the geopolitical alliances, SEATO and ANZUS, and the general sense of fear, terror about communism spreading north to south, heading towards, the world's crown jewel.
You might even say paranoia.
You might say that, yeah. McCarthy had a hand in stoking the
Uh-huh.
flames of paranoia.
And what's this episode all about then?
So I think we're going to tell a little bit more personal accounts this time.
Yeah.
So we're moving away from that bird's eye view, global politics sort of perspective on the events and looking at some individual stories. And we read a couple of books by a guy called Frank Walker,
Yeah.
who also owns National Tiles in Australia.
Yeah.
And I think the story with the most meat on the bone probably is The Tiger Man, which we will jump into in this episode. But he also has a book called Ghost Platoon, which you read and
Yeah.
really enjoyed. And I think it was, a story that we didn't just want to cast aside as well, because we are trying to shine a bit of light on some of the lesser well-known stories from Vietnam.
Yeah, and just a forewarning, Ghost Platoon's pretty grim. Like it's definitely not a happy story. So, but that kind of sums up the Vietnam War in some ways. It's,
Yeah. Vietnam in a microcosm.
Anyway, should we crack in?
Yeah, so if you want to start with Ghost Platoon, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about how the Tiger Man tried to avert some of the
Rightio.
tragedy in a story like that.
Sounds good. Ghost Platoon. So this book is all about this platoon called the 2nd D&E Platoon, and it got the nickname Ghost Platoon because the Australian Army said that it never existed.
That is spooky.
Yeah. So I'm going to explain why this happened. Basically, with the Australian Army in Vietnam, soldiers that were conscripted or they signed up, they had to do 12 months, like a year of duty in Vietnam, right?
Mhm.
And the only way that you got out of your 12 months would be to either die, obviously,
Yep.
or you get injured or sick or sent home for various reasons. So unless that happened, you were there for 12 months. So that meant that there's kind of constant turnover in the frontline troops, right? Because, people were getting replaced.
Yeah, you need a strong bench for a war.
And that's where this group, the Ghost Platoon, comes in, because there were these 39 men. They were all kind of regular infantry. None of them were conscripts. They were all, signed up for this war. And they subbed into the 4th Battalion after a few people had kind of been sent home.
Run their race.
So they arrived in Vietnam as replacements, and the rest of the 4th Battalion, they finished their tour of duty. So
Yep,
they
in
all went
12
home.
months.
And these 39 guys were left there.
Twiddling thumbs.
And it was a bit of a mess when this happened, because the army in some ways forgot about them, because they didn't have a sergeant, they didn't have a lieutenant, they didn't have any kind of clear leadership once the rest of the 4th Battalion went home. And there was no clear duties or orders.
Mhm.
They were a bit of a ramshackle group. So this one guy, Jim Riddle, he basically took over. He was
Is
just
that Voldemort?
no, that's Tom Riddle, mate. You're getting your riddles mixed up.
Oh, sorry.
Jim Riddle we're talking about, and he was just a corporal, but no one was taking charge of this group, the 2nd D&E Platoon. So he just decided that's my job.
It's like when you leave your class for a minute.
Yeah.
Kids have to figure out who's in charge,
Yeah.
who dies.
Yeah, and this Jim Riddle guy, he's a pretty interesting character, because he was a commando with the British Marines, right? So he was in the British Army, because he's from England, and he was a bit of a career soldier. His dad was in the army, like he fought in World War II, and he obviously saw a lot of bad things and had some horrific times in World War II, and he he brought those horrors home,
Mm-hmm.
which created a pretty tough home life for Jim. But Jim joined the army with Britain, and he was pretty into it. But then when Britain decided to not get involved in Vietnam,
Good call.
which in hindsight was a great move,
Mm.
Jim was obviously not that stoked about it because he thought he needed to play his part to stop the red tide and to stop communism.
You see that a lot in Vietnam too, with those soldiers who are the children of, the liberating heroes of Europe, and
They got something to prove, don't they?
totally, yeah. Even though obviously Jim's seen his dad come home with the scars of war, he still,
Yeah.
feels like he needs to do that.
Yeah, so I mean, probably mostly for noble reasons, but also the fact that maybe he wanted to get away from a tough home life.
Mm.
Jim Riddle transfers into the Australian Army so he can fight in Vietnam. So he comes over. He'd been in the British Army for a while, so he should have been promoted to sergeant. But his biggest issue was he loved getting steamed.
Yep.
He got himself in a little bit of trouble from probably having too much to drink, and he was just at the rank of corporal, which is basically the lowest officer rank.
Mm-hmm.
But then somehow he's ended up in Vietnam and he's in charge of a bunch of replacements,
Yeah.
basically because there's no one else.
Yeah.
So here they are, this kind of ragtag group, the 2nd D&E platoon, and they get given some orders from the Australian Army. They've had some intelligence that there's a bunch of Viet Cong and Viet Minh Army, and they're going to be marching down this road. So they send in this group and they say, okay, perch yourself up on this wee hill in the jungle here, because there's potentially going to be some of the enemy walking through this area. That's the word on the street.
Opportunity for an ambush.
Yeah, potentially. And they also gave them a group of APCs, like armored personnel carriers. So there was this.
Do they give them guns?
Yep, they had guns. They were
Okay.
all ready to go. But Captain Aerosmith was in charge of these 4 armored personnel carriers. So they set up on the side of the road. Meanwhile, the Ghost platoon was kind of perched up in the jungle in an ideal position. And they all just sat there. And they're in this place called Tua Teach, this little place with this big gate. And this was the potential ideal spot for an ambush. So they all sat there in the jungle, and no one really knew if the intelligence was correct, if they were just going to sit out all night and not see anything. And they were thinking, oh, maybe five people will walk through here, 10 people will walk through here.
Mm.
And then, it became nighttime and it was all pretty dark, and suddenly they heard some noise, and a bunch of Viet Cong started walking down this road, and more kept coming around the corner until there's like 100 plus soldiers
Man.
walking down this road. And these guys are pretty nervous, the Ghost platoon, because there's only 39 of them.
They don't even know who's in charge.
Yeah, and they're sitting there waiting until the ideal time. And then eventually, once all the Viet Cong were almost past them, Jim Riddle gave the order, and they all stood up and started firing along with the APCs, and they
Mhm.
did a lot of damage. And
So the APCs had mounted machine guns. didn't they?
mounted machine guns, and pretty significant casualties on the Vietnamese side. And it was pretty successful for the Australians. So there's lots of screaming, there's lots of confusion, and it was dark, and no one really knew what was going on. And eventually, the Vietnamese retreated, and the Australians also managed to call in an AC-47 gunship.
Oh, just for good measure.
Yeah, to kind of like clean up whatever was left.
Speaking of it being at night and like scary, I think the one scene from all of the Vietnam War movies that has really stuck in my head, it's from Mel Gibson's We Were Soldiers.
Yeah.
And there's a moment when the US soldiers are in the jungle, it's night, I think it's raining, and they know that there's Viet Cong around, and all of a sudden there's a flash of lightning.
Yeah.
And they're illuminated and they're directly in front of them.
Yeah.
Like the terror of being out there in the jungle at night and just not knowing where this
Yeah.
enemy that was largely invisible was anyway. It must have been
Yeah.
overwhelming.
It just sounds like there was so much confusion because you
Mm.
just can't see what's going on. You don't know where the enemy was, and the firing stops, but you don't know if they're still there hiding.
Well,
or
it's
if
in
they've-
those moments where you need to have good leadership, right?
Yeah.
Because you look to those leaders. What do we do when we're uncertain?
And when you read Ghost Platoon, you kind of hear that Jim Riddle was just absolutely cool and calm, and he looked after the members of the Ghost Platoon, and they did an amazing job. And once this gunship was called. This is these massive planes with massive Gatling guns on the side. Like the Vietnamese were so
It's a
scared.
chopper, right?
What's that?
Chopper?
No, it's actually it's a plane. It's a DC-3 with these big Gatling
Oh, right,
guns. The Vietnamese thought they were fire-breathing dragons. That's how like scared they were of them because
Yeah.
they were just such massive firepower.
Yeah.
They kind of came in and rained death from the sky. So once the gunship had come in, that kind of made the area safe, and everything cleared out. They realised that they'd killed at least 16 Viet Cong, and there'd been no Australian casualties. And they'd essentially disrupted the supply lines of the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong. So this was a massive deal for the Australians. It was a big win. And as soon as the kind of higher ups heard about this, they were pretty stoked. So they flew in their choppers.
Yeah.
All the officers.
You'd want to publicise this.
Yeah. So they brought with them a couple of military journalists to kind of document it, and to shake hands and to congratulate the guys involved in the ambush. So this is great. This is great for the Ghost Platoon. Jim Riddle's pretty stoked. No Australian casualties, and we've done a whole bunch of damage
USA
to the enemy. And obviously, Aerosmith as well was pretty stoked.
Aerosmith's a great name for a soldier.
Solid.
Yeah.
Solid name. So that was looking good. There's, handshakes all round, and there's the promise of medals for Jim Riddle and some of the platoon. And everything's happy as.
Jim got what he wanted.
Unfortunately, this is when things started to turn, because a local Vietnamese police major also heard about the ambush, and he came on down to see what was going on. And he said to Aerosmith, he said, "Hey, look, we need to kind of like start putting people off joining the Viet Cong, and this is a great opportunity to show them what happens when you sign up for the Viet Cong, when you sign up with the enemy. So what I want you to do is take some of these bodies, because there was 16 dead bodies lying on the road. Take some of these bodies, and I want you to tie them to the APC and bring them to my village, and we're going to string them up, and we can show the villagers, this is the consequences.
Yeah, there's
picking the wrong side.
Yeah, there's a PBS documentary about the My Lai massacre.
Yeah,
where members of Charlie Company talk about it being important to go into the villages and make them fear you more than the Viet Cong, because that's where their allegiance is going to lie.
Yeah. And it was a bit of a propaganda war, right?
Yeah, totally.
Hearts and minds.
Yeah.
And the Allies were trying to get on side with the villagers. So, by the stage that all the higher ups had left in their chopper, but they had left with them the military journalists. So the military journalists are there taking photos of, the ambush and some of the dead bodies and things like that. And Captain Aerosmith is kind of like thinking about this request that's been asked of him from the police officer. And he's like, oh man, yeah, should I do it? But he kind of remembers that they've been told that they should be working with the police, right? They're on your side. You've got to help them out as much as you can. So he decides, okay, we need to do this. We need to string up these guys behind the APC and take them to his village. And Jim Riddle kind of protests a bit, like he doesn't think it's right. But that's what Captain Aerosmith decides.
Wow, what a moment in time. That's a life changer for everyone involved.
Yep. And, the journalists are there as well.
Yeah.
So they decide to obviously take some photos. And off they go, this APC towing behind the 3 dead bodies.
Right.
So this is the year 1969. And what's interesting is in 1966, there was this famous photo taken pretty much of the same thing, like of the Americans dragging some bodies behind an APC. And it was pretty well known. It was like, what was it, World Photo of the Year or something like that?
Yeah, it was pretty well known, yeah.
And it was some really bad PR for the Americans. Like, it was not a good look to be doing that. It's, pretty humiliating. And the Allies are meant to be morally sound.
The goodies, that's certainly the way we're taught it, yeah.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how often it happens, though. Like that sort of thing. Was it standard practice and just a couple of times they were busted?
Yeah. So some photos were taken, and the journalist, whose name was Bellis, he kind of said that he remembers Captain Aerosmith saying, "Don't take any pictures of the bodies." And Bellis said, "Well, I did, because like most press photographers, I hate being told what I can't take photos of and what I can.
There's a whole reason for being there."
So as soon as someone told me that I shouldn't take a photo of this, I went and did it.
Yeah.
because it's an insult to my profession.
Yeah, fair enough.
So all of these photos were taken of, this humiliating act. There was also other things going on, like they did what's called an engineer's burial of some of the dead bodies, because one of the rules was if you have got enemy dead bodies, you meant to give it a proper burial and you meant to record where they're buried. So later on, the family can come and find it. But there was talk that some of them were just put into a big hole and explosives were put underneath them just to get rid of the bodies quickly, which is also a big no-no. So there's these incidents that happened straight after this kind of ambush, this kind of victory for the Australians. And because all of this was documented by the journalists, it got made into a bigger deal. Fortunately for the, Australian Army, these photos that were taken had to go through the censor first. And as soon as the military censor saw them, it quickly realised that if these get out into the major papers, this would be a really bad look for the Australian Army. And at this time in 1969, they were working really hard to keep the public on side because already
people were burning draft cards and
people were turning against the war, starting to realise, hey, maybe we shouldn't be in Vietnam.
Yeah, partly because of the work of journalists like your mate. Yeah.
So the defence censor basically obliterated that album, and most of the photos that got taken, a lot of them, the bad ones, never really saw the light of day, and the army brass basically buried the photos and covered up the whole incident. And to really kind of try and erase it, they decided we also need to get rid of the ghost platoon. We need to break them up. We need to send them into different kind of platoons, and we need to wipe them from the history books.
Yeah, right.
And that's basically what happened. So from then on, the Australian Army kind of denied that the 2nd D&E platoon even existed. That's how dedicated they were to try and get rid of this story.
Yeah.
Which is really sad because these guys had done this amazing thing. They'd gone through a real stressful situation, and now they were being told that this never happened.
Yeah.
They were in line for a bunch of medals. All those were taken off the table, and they weren't recognised for anything. So that's what the Ghost Platoon story is all about. And Jim Riddle, by the end of the Vietnam War, he had served 734 days in Vietnam.
Oh,
this
right.
is way more than most soldiers.
Yeah.
He started before Christmas in 1968, and he finished on the 9th of March 1972, making him one of the last Australian infantrymen to leave Vietnam. During that time, Riddle had served in the 4th, 9th, and 8th Battalion. So he did his 12 months, and then he came back and did another tour.
Yeah.
So,
well, military man from a military family.
Yeah. But by his own admission, he did say that the last 12 months he spent in Vietnam, he basically got as drunk as he could.
Yeah.
He just drank to get drunk. He got into a lot of trouble.
Didn't want to go home.
He didn't want to go home. He didn't like who he was, so he tried to drink to forget it.
Well, it's a good thing he didn't exist then.
Yeah. He tried suicide a couple of times. He was pretty messed up. One time he drove a car into a pole and put his head through the windscreen. Someone came rushing up to him and said, "Are you all right?" And he said back to them, "Sure, I just decided to park here." So he still had a sense of humour.
Yeah.
He should have got a medical discharge from the army, but he didn't get any assistance. He was essentially abandoned. They didn't want to know who he was. The only thing he got was a visit from the dentist, and that was to fix some teeth that had been smashed up by a ricocheting bullet. So Vietnam really messed Jim Riddle up.
Yeah.
Like, he was a mess.
There's so many stories like that from Vietnam and every war, but, we just know more about Vietnam, where the duty of care of the country that's sending these soldiers in, it doesn't extend indefinitely. They're like, go here, we're going to reward you for doing things that in everyday life are horrific. Like, do those things, but then also hold them to certain standards in terms of decision-making in moments of extreme stress. It's so hard to figure out where you can apportion blame in moments like that.
Yeah, so in Jim Riddle's case, he was promised 2 medals during his service. One was with the 2nd D&E platoon, or the Ghost Platoon, and another one was with the 8th Battalion, but he didn't receive either because essentially he was a bit of a troublemaker, especially by the end of his service.
Too many parking infringements.
Yeah, and he was essentially edited out of all the histories for 39 years. with his work with the Ghost Platoon.
And that's why we're such an important podcast.
Yeah. So after the war, Jim Riddle went home to England to bury his father, who had died.
Oh, wow.
And once back in England, he kind of raised a family. He stayed there for 30 years. And as he became an old man, he decided, hey, I want to go back to Australia and see out my time there. And, you know, I served that country. I've still got a lot of mates from the war there. That's where I want to retire. So he tried to come back to Australia, but Australian immigration wouldn't let him back into the country because he hadn't kept up to date with his paperwork. So here he was kind of, you know, serving Australia, like probably one of the longest serving soldiers in the Vietnam War, and then he can't even visit.
Yeah.
He couldn't access a war pension from Australia because the higher ups had tried to erase his records. So there was no record saying this is the time that you'd served.
What's this big blank spot here in the middle?
Yeah. I mean, eventually they got that sorted after a lot of wrangling and many years of missing out.
Yeah, by the time he's like 80.
Yeah. And eventually he did get back into Australia, but unfortunately when he was there, he was in a halfway house and he got beaten up, got severely injured. Then he suffered a couple of strokes, and eventually he went back to the UK, but at the stage he was severely disabled.
This is one of those people that I'm in no way jealous of. Like the whole way through the story, I'm just feeling sympathy.
Yeah, so for 39 years, the Australian Army denied that the 2nd D&E unit existed. If you tried to look them up on any of the records, you wouldn't find them because essentially they'd been deleted. They were told that the ambush at Tuatich never happened and they weren't involved. So obviously the soldiers in this platoon were pretty upset by that, and they lobbied for years to get it written back into the record. And eventually, after lots of wrangling and lots of letters and lots of arguing, in 2008, MP Mike Kelly finally recognised the platoon. One of the things he said was, "Their success was a tribute to their professionalism and the outstanding leadership and courage of Corporal Riddle, whose personal actions ensured the survival of many members of the platoon who would otherwise have surely been killed." So finally, in 2008, it all got sorted out.
I wonder what the feeling was when that happened. Like whether there was a genuine sense of relief or whether it felt a bit hollow.
Almost 40 years after they were there.
Yeah.
That just frustration.
Yeah,
but
totally.
at least you know that your service is now being recognised.
Yeah, and will be in the record books moving forward.
And Jim Riddle died 10 years later in 2018 in the UK. So at least he was still alive to see his name get written back into the records.
Yeah.
But if you thought that story was grim, let me hit you with another one, another sad story from the Australian Army.
Off you go.
Have you heard of the term fragging?
Yeah, I have.
Have you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
What
is it?
It's not good.
Wow. Let me tell you.
It's a bit callous.
It was a term that was invented during the Vietnam War by American troops. And it came from the practice of disaffected soldiers throwing fragmentation hand grenades into the tents and bunkers of officers that they didn't like.
Okay, that's not what I thought it was. That's hectic.
And according to the Pentagon figures, the total number of US fragging incidents during Vietnam is estimated between 600 and 1,000.
So does that mean there were between 600 and 1,000 like murders? Premeditated engineers' murders?
Yeah, potentially.
Right.
So let me tell you about one that happened with the Australian Army. There's this guy called Peter Allen and his platoon commander, Robert Convery. And they were with the 9th Battalion. And they had pretty much finished their 12-month tour of Vietnam. Like they were being shipped back to Australia in 6 days, right? So everyone was in high spirits. They're looking forward to going home. Convery especially was looking forward to going home to Melbourne. He had been wounded in the arm a little bit, but he'd enjoyed his tour of duty in Vietnam. And lots of his friends and other soldiers said he was an easygoing chap and he's a pretty keen officer. So on the 23rd of December 1969, Private Peter Allen reached into the tent of his commanding officer, Robert Convery, and he placed a grenade under the sleeping man's body. Blew him to pieces. Crazy.
Because he didn't like him.
Because he didn't like him. I mean, he couldn't even explain to himself why he did it for a long time.
With 6 days left.
6 days left. Fragging was extremely rare in the Australian Army, so this was a massive deal. It was all over the Australian media, and Allen went straight in for the court-martial. This was not the publicity that the Australian Army wanted. The 20-year-old, Peter Allen, his main reason was he didn't like the lieutenant. He said that on the night of the murder, he had about 50 to 20 cans.
Oh, that's all right then.
So he was steamed.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Boys will be boys.
And he said if he hadn't have been drunk, it probably wouldn't have happened. It was the cheapness of life, the bloodlust that had built up over my time in Vietnam that combined to make me do the act. But the crazy thing was there's 6 days to go, right?
Yeah.
All he had to do, even if he hated the guy,
Yeah.
is just hang out for 6 days. Just don't hang out with him.
Just flip him the bird and call him names.
So Peter Allen was sentenced to hard labour for life. He was locked up in this prison near Hobart in Tasmania. But after 10 and a half years, he was released early. And no one can actually explain why.
What?
So, crazy story.
Huh.
And the ironic thing is that his recruiting officer initially turned him down for the army. So when he was 17, he applied to go in the army, and the recruiting officer wrote down in his notes,
Warning.
he gets drunk regularly. He's only 17 years old. He's already been booked on 2 charges of assault and abusive behaviour. He's a hopeless underachiever, and he looks like potential trouble to me. Denied him from the army. So good to see the recruiting officers doing his job. Unfortunately, a year later, Australia's getting pretty desperate for troops.
Yeah.
He just joins up, no worries.
Open the gates and let anyone in.
And
Well, it's no wonder he enjoyed his tour then, if that was his general character.
yeah. So pretty sad story. But Lieutenant Convery wasn't the first Australian to be murdered by someone on their own side. Here's another story. In July 1969, there was this pretty 19-year-old Australian singer called Kathy Wayne, and she was performing on stage to 75 US Marines in an American NCO club in Da Nang. She'd just finished her final song, right? And she was introducing her fellow performers when a shot rang out. A 22 millimeter bullet hit her in the chest, went right through her lungs, and she fell down and died within seconds in the arms of her fiancé, who was the group's drummer.
Wow.
Turns out this US Marine sergeant named James Killen, ironically, was charged with the killing.
Killing. You've been out killing. You been killing again?
He was a 38-year-old from Alabama, and he basically said he was trying to hit his commanding officer, Major Roger Simmons, and he missed, and unfortunately hit the singer.
Yeah.
And she was the first Australian woman killed in the Vietnam War.
That reminds me of Kent State shootings, Vietnam protests in Kent State in the States when the National Guard were called in. And I remember reading about one of the students who was shot was walking like a couple of 100 feet away from the actual protest itself and was hit by a bullet from the National Guard, and it just lodged in his spine, and I'm pretty sure he was paralyzed forever from that point. Just one of those wildly unfortunate random bullets that,
Just senseless violence, isn't it?
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm just going to finish, and I'm going to leave you with a quote from Jim Riddle, since he is such an integral part of this story. And when they're kind of interviewing him years after the war, he said,
Expelliarmus.
He said, we all died in that war. Some of us are just taking longer to stop breathing. And I think that kind of sums up the after effects of being in Vietnam.
That is profound.
If anyone knows, he knows.
He knows.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that Jim Riddle was one of the last Australian soldiers to leave Vietnam.
Yeah.
The story that I'm going to jump into about the Tiger Man of Vietnam features the first Australian soldier to set foot on Vietnamese soil.
Well, let's hope it is a bit more uplifting than the story I told, because that was
it is the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
So, try as we might, it's going to be a Vietnam War story.
Okay.
But it is about the Tiger Man, and so sort of want to provide a bit of context to provide a bit of information about the kind of character he is. We can understand how his background, his upbringing made him the person that he was and how he could deal with the situations that he faced. So this Tiger Man was called Barry Peterson.
Solid, strong name.
It is a strong name. Yeah, it's a bit Charles Upham.
Yeah, I mean Barry's pretty good for like it's a pretty solid Australian name, isn't it?
Bazar.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's got a good ring to it. Well, Barry was born in 1935 in the scorching tropical heat of Serena, which is a tiny beach town in the Mackay region. So it's about 1,000 k's north of Bris Vegas.
Yeah.
And when he was young, Barry's dad, who was called Arthur but for some reason preferred to be called Frank, went off to fight in Papua New Guinea. And so he left Barry and his two younger sisters in the care of their mother and their grandfather, Hans. And Barry spent quite a lot of time outdoors with his granddad, Hans, and
Hans
in doing
Gruber.
so, different Hans.
Oh, yeah.
In doing so, though, he developed a real appreciation for the outdoors,
Yeah.
but also an ability to thrive in it, to live off the land, to
Strangle snakes.
Well, yeah, but basically identify risks and deal with them.
Yeah.
On fishing trips, Hans would force little Barry to face his fears. Get out there, Baz. Wade out into the water up to your neck.
Grab
to
a
set
croc.
grab a croc.
Death roll 'em.
Snap its neck. No, they were fishing and they had these nets that they'd put across these little estuary channels.
Yeah.
And so Barry would go out into the deep water end and set the net down there. And if you wander into the coastal waters of Queensland, you kind of got to have your head on a swivel. You mentioned crocs.
Yeah.
There's turtles.
Megalodons.
Yes. Jason Statham is in the water.
Yeah.
But sharks are abundant. Like
Yeah.
there's hammerheads, there's bull sharks. And Barry was terrified of sharks.
Oh, toughen up, Barry.
Well, that was Hans' opinion.
Yeah, good
That's
on
why I sent
Hans.
him out there. And Barry did, later on say those moments were important. I learned to overcome my fears. You know that fear when you are almost crippled, you can't move. That's how Barry felt.
We need more Hanses in the world, don't we?
Yeah, well, Hans certainly made Barry push through.
Yeah.
And so he was able to, in those moments of pure terror, still function.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to be cynical, maybe Hans was just a bit cowardly,
Mm-hmm.
but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. So, spurred on by his helpful or cowardly granddad and his love of those outdoor adventures,
Yes.
Barry also joined the Scouts.
Oh,
He wanted to be prepared, so he set about earning pretty much every badge that you can earn and picked up plenty of, practical survival skills.
sewing badge.
Sewing badge, probably.
Yeah.
Yep.
Nice.
Neck snapping badge.
Oh,
from
yeah.
The crocodile incident.
Death rolling badge.
Yeah. Barry's time with his granddad didn't last forever, though, because Barry's dad, Arthur/Frank, he was one of the fortunate few to return from World War II. And upon his return, the Peterson family moved even further north into the sticky heat of Innisfail, which is up near Cairns. So I guess it's important to note that Barry developed a love of the outdoors when he was really young, of living relatively rough, but also of picking up a skill set to survive in those rough conditions.
Yeah.
And he was used to doing all of that in sticky, horrible, humid air that you can sort of swim through.
I'm just imagining Crocodile Hunter.
Yeah, basically.
You
but
call that a
mini
knife?
version at this point.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah. So while sweating his way through Scouts and school and, with his father back in the picture, Barry was also exposed to a wide variety of cultures too, because where they lived, there were a lot of sugarcane and banana plantations. And a lot of the workers who came in there for that sort of manual labor came from Italian, Chinese, Greek backgrounds, Aboriginal backgrounds. And Barry always had a really nice and natural way of ingratiating himself into those different cultural settings.
Yep.
He just had a good understanding of what was right, what wasn't, and how to be respectful. And so, all of those ingredients also contribute to the recipe that, Barry built off to make himself successful later on. He ended up finishing high school in Brisbane. He went to Industrial High School and he met a bunch of students there from Asia. And they were there as part of the Colombo Plan, which was like a Commonwealth cooperative scheme where people from different countries around Asia and the Pacific would go to those different nations and learn from each other. And so Barry learned a lot about Asia in this moment. He had a few close friends and he became fascinated by the history of Asia, but also, what would later develop there with the Vietnam War. In 1952, like all young Aussie blokes at the time, Barry had to enlist for a compulsory 3-month stint in the National Service. And you spoke about the Korean War in our
Yes.
last episode, and that is raging in 1952. Fortunately for Barry and everyone else in the National Service, they were not called into the fight. But Barry was frothing his time in the service.
Oh, was he loving it?
He loved it. He was learning how to fight close quarters,
Uh-huh.
He did some marksman training, but he also learned how to sort of structure his life and to be efficient in his daily routine.
Fold his socks,
Yeah, things like that.
iron his pants.
Yeah, well, he loved all the ironing so much. He immediately went to officer cadet school in Victoria
Yes.
and ended up training national service troops himself. So he was one, and now he was the trainer.
Just yelling at people.
Pretty much, yeah. Those fold your socks, snap its neck. And he was a really good teacher, though. He excelled in his role. And in 1957, he was transferred to the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, back in his home state of Queensland.
Banana benders.
Yeah. And this was sort of the final step in his preparation before he actually saw service, because at this point, Australia supporting the British in their pretty heroic efforts to just steal Malaya's rubber and tin industries.
Typical.
Well, to steal back. They were facing pretty stiff competition from Chinese communist guerrilla fighters to do that. And proving again his sort of cultural curiosity, his adaptability, Barry just quickly learned Malay, as you do.
Just overnight.
Yeah. And he quickly took to his anti-guerrilla jungle warfare training like a shark takes to the Queensland waters.
Oh, yeah, I like it.
So we did touch on the Malayan emergency in our previous episode, and this was to be another one of Barry's sort of training exercises. As much as his boots are on the ground, he's still learning, and many of the skills that he'd already developed were further sharpened here. Long before Hitler made it pretty uncool to have concentration camps, the Brits were doing it in Malaya. They'd picked up the habit in the Boer War and had transferred that here, and there was a real sense of ethnic tension. They were rounding up ethnic Chinese Malays, putting them in these camps, which were surrounded by barbed wire. There were armed guards, spotlights, the whole shebang. Barry was quickly made a platoon commander in this environment, and his directive was explicitly to hunt down communist guerrillas who were hiding out in, the sweltering jungles.
Yeah.
And to do this, he worked with a tribal group called the Orang Asli, which is Malay for original people. And I mentioned the, ethnic element to this Malayan emergency. Well, the Orang Asli were looked down upon. They were sneered at by the majority of Malays and ethnic Chinese. But Barry, he didn't sneer at these men at all. He viewed them as like super trackers, really. Hunters. They were obviously jungle survivalists. They were experts, and he learned a lot from them. But he turned them into a really effective fighting force as well. And long story short, because the focus of this is in Vietnam, but Barry's skills and training there were noticed by Colonel John Miller, who recommended Barry for maybe some more work in that specific, realm of jungle warfare. So when he got back to Aussie in 1962, Barry was one of 5 soldiers asked whether he would be willing to act as a military advisor in South Vietnam.
Love a good military advisor.
Yeah. And he was willing. So he and 34 other men, so 35 in total, were gathered together to see, based on their past experience, plus a little training bit that they'd done, who had been selected to form the team who would be training the South Vietnamese in jungle warfare and village defense. And, surely Barry's a shoo-in.
Yeah, you'd think so.
But it was a situation much like, when you're picking teams in schoolyard sports, you've got the captain standing there, choosing out names, like Ben first.
Bring up bad memories, mate.
It was like that because Barry's standing there just pretending, like you do, that he hasn't noticed his name hasn't been called yet until he's left. He's one of the 5 who have not been chosen, and he's a bit bewildered by this.
And you're looking across at the other person, you realise they're the most unco person ever.
Yeah.
And they get picked before you.
They can't even catch.
Yeah. And when they get picked before you, it's like...
It's time to switch schools.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Barry was a proud man, and so, he walked away from that confused. But as he's sort of shambling away from that throng, congratulating themselves, he's pulled aside.
Yes.
A hand grabs him by the sleeve and says, "Hey, Barry, how would you like to be involved in some special operations training?"
Do you want to join my team?
Yeah. He's been picked up by the All Blacks.
Yeah. Yeah.
All of a sudden. Wasn't picked for the first 15.
Yeah. He just skipped that whole...
Yeah.
Skipped the NPC in the Super Rugby.
Graham Henry's waiting for him in the bushes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he's ordered to tell absolutely no one about this opportunity. It's special operations. So there's an element of clandestine cloak and dagger about it.
Hmm.
And he's just given this address in Melbourne. So he pulls up outside an unmarked office block, and it's just one grey block among many unmarked office blocks. He walks up to the most boring reception desk in the world and then waits politely before being thoroughly examined by a doctor. Full cavity search.
Don't you reckon just all these kind of like spy organizations like the
Hmm.
CIA and MI6 and all that, they just take themselves too seriously? Like they think that everyone's watching, but in reality, no one really cares.
You think they should hide in plain sight?
Yeah, I just think that it's like, mate, all this kind of like, you can't tell anyone. Blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
It's like, mate,
Tell whoever you want.
just relax.
Yeah, here's a name tag and a uniform.
You're working as a spy.
Yeah. Well, they did take themselves seriously anyway. They took this cavity search seriously.
Yeah.
So after he's finished his medical, he's ushered into another room, and there's 5 men in front of him sitting at a desk, and they're not interested in telling him their names or why they needed to look in his butt. They just get straight to the questions. So what do you think the first question is? You know, think of the serious tone here.
First question. Are you racist?
I mean, pretty close, to be honest.
Yeah.
How would you feel if your sister married an Aboriginal?
So basically that.
Basically the same question, yeah. And, you know, to the extent that we know Barry, he's grown up with that multicultural environment. He's proven himself pretty adept
Yeah.
at, you know, being a bit of an octopus, camouflaging in different situations. His answer's pretty predictable. He just goes, well, it's up to her. Does she love him? You
Yeah,
know?
well played, Barry.
Yeah,
well
shot
played.
Barry. What a guy.
Yeah.
Barry's answers, they must have pleased the nameless men as much as they've pleased us, because he was invited back a little bit later to sign some papers. And in doing that, he was essentially pledging that he wouldn't reveal any of the information that he was about to learn.
Yeah, don't tell anyone.
No, this is serious business. If he did reveal anything, the best case scenario is basically significant prison time.
Yeah.
You know, but they take it seriously. So,
Or we're going to pull your toenails off.
or you might be ghosted. Who knows? Barry's not daunted by this, though. He's a brave bloke. He's faced down sharks.
Yeah, he's raised by Hans.
Exactly. He's like, do you know who I am?
Hans is my granddad.
Yeah, so he signs, and as he does that, one of the nameless men finally reveals a little snippet of actual information. He tells Barry that he works for ASIS, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service.
Mm-hmm.
And Barry was one of very few who were in on the fact that ASIS even existed. They were a real proper, like, manila folder, briefcase swapping,
Yeah.
Cold War spy agency. They were basically Australia's version of the CIA, and they were formed back in 1952 when Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies sort of genie wished them into existence with an executive order.
Yeah, he was a bit of a warmonger though, wasn't he, Menzies?
Well, yeah, and I think Australia just needed a presence in that Cold War geopolitics, cloak and dagger stuff. And so he created them, but no one else, even in the Australian government, knew that they existed for 20 years until 1972.
Yeah.
And they were only exposed because of some good journalism. The Daily Telegraph noticed that there was an organisation that was trying to recruit candidates from Australian universities. And so that was sort of the basis for their little expose.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, in 1962, which is the time that we're at now, ASIS was an organisation that, obviously, despite existing, didn't officially exist. They had no property, no one worked for them, and they definitely didn't have a Director General. If they did, it was Major General Sir Walter Cawthorne, and he was Barry's boss, and it was his wish that Barry go out and complete the next stage of his training on Swan Island.
Swan Island.
Mm.
Sounds romantic.
So very briefly, Swan Island's sort of the finishing school for Aussie spies. So it's a place that not many people still know about, built back in the 1850s.
Is it like when in James Bond he goes down into that room and tries on the watches with lasers and
I think so.
the glasses that set bombs off and all that technology stuff?
Yeah, Q's there.
Yeah, Q, yeah.
Yeah.
Q's running the school.
Yeah. I said the island was built during the 1850s, but there was a fort built on the island in
Nice.
the 1850s to stop the Ruskies.
Yep.
Pesky Crimean War.
Yeah, because they're quite close to Australia, aren't they?
Yeah, very close. Big threat.
Natural enemy.
Yeah, but it's one of those places where it's a bit like Grand Theft Auto. If you get a little bit too close to the shore, you're very quickly chased off by pretty well-armed, scary-looking people.
Yeah, nice.
So it's very clandestine. Barry loved it on Swan Island, though, because he picked up
Of
all
course he
that
did.
Cold War spycraft. He learned how to create and break ciphers and I mentioned briefcase drops and how to
He was
set.
doing Sudokus all day.
Yeah, he was checking for listening devices though too. Techniques to follow someone unseen, like all that good stuff, right up Barry's alley.
Just hide and seek.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For
He didn't
for
nail
adults.
it from the beginning though. I mentioned Frank Walker's books earlier, and in The Tiger Man of Vietnam, Walker tells a story about Barry and his spy school mates who are sent into a little town in Victoria to gain some specific information without arousing suspicion. So don't be weird. Just go and see if you can find out the answer to this question.
This sounds like a great lads weekend.
Yeah, how fun. How
Yeah,
good would that be?
Yeah.
So Barry later described arriving back at their hotel. They'd been out all day. They were feeling very
At the
sneaky.
pub.
Yeah, get stoomed or pretending to. They felt super sneaky though and accomplished. Like they'd accomplished their mission. But as they do get back to the hotel, go down to the bar, they hear a bunch of locals talking about this weird group of strangers who are snooping about, asking
I
suspicious
bet you
questions.
they were super obvious.
Yeah, they were wearing their uniforms.
They're wearing name tags.
Yeah, that's when
Spy school.
ASIS went underground. They started to take it seriously.
Yeah.
Spying isn't easy though, you know,
Mm.
and it was just a blip. Barry was soon honing his spycraft, and one of his mates, John Healy, who will pop up a little bit throughout the story, wrote to Barry saying, "Barry, mate, you've been headhunted. You're going to be my replacement when you get to Vietnam."
Oh man, that's good.
Yeah, so Barry's not 100% sure about what that means. And in the back of his mind, he's also turning over the very real possibility of being captured, you know, maybe tortured.
Yeah.
And with this in mind, he signed up for one more course before he departed Australia. And it's called the Code of Conduct course. That's its official title. But those with their ear to the ground called it something else. They called it Torture School.
Torture school.
Yeah, and
Sounds awesome.
I'm pretty sure you know a bit more about this than me.
Oh,
Do you
I
want
love torture school.
to? Yeah.
I'd like
It's
to
everyday class for
I'd like
you.
to teach at torture school.
Welcome to Torture School.
Yeah, well, this is another one of these weird places that, you know, if you were a wannabe spy, you'd sign up for this course.
Mm.
But basically, they're trying to teach them how would you deal with it if you got tortured? How do you like overcome the challenge of that? And it was run on this military land, a bit like Swan Island. It was an old fort, built again to stop the Russians. So they had all these kind of like tunnels and underground storage rooms that were dug for gun emplacements. So they had all this awesome old school castles to do all this classic torture in.
Mm-hmm.
So what they did is they got 14 soldiers signed up for this, and the purpose was not to train them to withstand physical torture, but more to help them understand what techniques would be used if they got taken prisoner, and at least they would know what to expect and how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Psychological training.
Yeah, essentially. So the first thing they did as these 14 soldiers started torture school is they took their clothes off them and then gave them this prison outfit, but it was really badly fitting. It was torn, it was stained, it was smelly,
Mm-hmm.
and the worst thing, this is the little technique for you to use, is the pants didn't fit. They were too big,
Mm.
so the pants just kept falling down, and they weren't allowed a belt, so they had to hold their pants up with their hands.
Yeah, right.
Can you imagine that?
Annoying
The shame
and
the
humiliating.
the humiliation.
Yeah.
This is the first step in breaking
Such a hassle.
breaking
though.
down the prisoner, humiliate them by
Mm.
holding their own pants.
Yep.
They also were giving individual cells. So the 14 of them had their own cells, but they didn't stay in one cell. They constantly moved cells because they didn't want them to become familiar with anything. Because
Yes.
familiarity, like kind of, you can survive with that.
Yeah. So it wasn't their cell. They
It
didn't
wasn't
have
their
a place
cell.
of
They
their
were
own.
always being moved, and they didn't know when they were going to get moved.
Yeah.
And every room was different. One room was like the music room. It had a loudspeaker that was blasting out these communist
Sounds nice.
anthems.
Yeah.
Yeah, like One Direction or something. And anyway, there's this other room called the Whistle Stop. It had this loudspeaker that just let off this shrieking noise. Yeah, just like that. Just non-stop, making it impossible to sleep.
Yeah.
There's another room they called the Pit, and this was accessed by a ladder. You climb down a ladder into ankle-deep water.
That's PIT for our international listeners.
Yeah,
Pit.
pit. And, completely dark and silent, and just water all around you.
Mm-hmm.
So constantly being moved through these rooms. Peterson was kind of bruised. He was cold, filthy, in pain. He hadn't been allowed to sleep for days. It's only like wet floors to lie on, and he had these like clothes that just didn't fit him. The jacket was real tight and small on him, and the pants were
That's
too
worse
big.
than the loose pants.
So it's not like everything's too big. One's too small, one's too big.
That is torture.
But he made an absolute breakthrough when he found this loose wire that was hanging from a disused light fitting. So he took that wire and he made a
Killed a guard.
no, even better. He made a belt
Oh, right.
to hold his pants up. Huge move. Finally, he had some dignity.
Power move.
Once you've got dignity, you can do anything.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, like, they were constantly getting called in for some interrogation with the guards. And unfortunately, during interrogation, the guards found his belt. And mate, the guards were pissed.
Yeah.
Contraband.
Contraband.
No one makes a belt in this prison.
Yeah. Who do you think you are?
Yeah, so he got his belt taken off him and he got thrown back in the pit. And in the pit, he had to climb back down into the water, and he was left there. And he was lying down there in the water, and then he started hearing the rats, and the rats were scurrying around. And he found the only dry bit of floor on the thing, but unfortunately, that's also the favorite place of the rats.
Rats found it too.
So these are the conditions he was in. And the guards were doing all sorts of things to try and break the soldiers, because they were given terrible food, but they would offer them really nice food just to try and get some information out of them. They'd say, if you just tell us some things about you, we can give you all of this nice food. But Peterson refused to talk. He refused to eat. They tried another tactic as well. They brought in, the good cop. They brought in this counselor who was a really nice guy. They brought Peterson into his office. It was nice and dry and warm, and he sat behind a desk with a nice, friendly, smiling man.
Hey, Barry.
Yeah. And one of the rules that he'd been told is that the interrogators don't know anything about you. They haven't researched your record or anything like that. The only thing they know about you is what you've told them, right? So the interrogator smiles and he says to him, "How are you going? Oh, this must be really tough because, it's really cold and damp, and you're coming from Queensland. It must be really hard on you." And this really shook Barry because he hadn't mentioned at all that he's from Queensland. And in his head, he's like, how did he find out I'm from Queensland? It kind of nagged at him.
What did I break kind of thing?
Did I say it without realizing it? Did I give it away? How does he know?
Yeah.
And he was really worried, but he only gave his answer. His only answer was his name, his rank, and his serial number. That's the only thing he'd told them.
Yeah.
And that was, he just kept saying that over and over and nothing else, because he was so determined to get through torture school without giving out any information.
Got to make Hans proud.
Yeah, and eventually soldiers get led outside into the fresh air, and it's the first time they've felt fresh air in days. And an Australian army officer comes up to them and says, "It's over. It's all over. You're through." And they weren't sure if he was telling the truth or not.
Oh, you'd be so wary.
And then they look around, and everyone's laughing and half crying with relief, and they realise that they've actually made it through torture school. But there's not 14 of them anymore. A couple of people didn't make it through the ordeal, and they found out later that one of them kind of had a bit of a mental breakdown and ended up in hospital. So the torture school was definitely living up to its name.
Speaking of Barry as well, really wanting to make it through.
Yeah.
I remember reading that he later on realised how the interrogator knew that he was from Queensland. It's because he had a 1 at the beginning of his serial number, and the first number designated the state that you were from. And so he talked about that being just this incredible moment of relief, because he still had that element of doubt. He's like, wait, did I break? Can I be proud of myself? And he was like, haha.
Man, he's pretty hard on himself.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Barry learned some important lessons from torture school, and the biggest one being you've got to keep hope alive. If you can keep hope, then that will keep you sane no matter what the kind of conditions. And after this, he felt like he was ready for Vietnam.
Well, that's good, because by 1963, the US had about 14,000 military advisors.
That's a lot of advice.
It's a lot of advice, yeah, in Vietnam. And so these advisors were training South Vietnamese troops and civilians to defend themselves and their villages. But things were not going that well. At least, that's how it appeared to the soldiers. Advisors.
Yes, get it right, please.
Yeah, who were in the field. So they're the ones doing the training. They're seeing the day-to-day situation unfold. And the US brass, all the way back down south in Saigon, were pretty much ignoring any reports that were coming back regarding the lack of ability, initiative shown by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, who we'll just refer to as the ARVN.
Yep.
And it's important to remember, too, that JFK was a complete believer in the domino theory.
Yeah.
And so
passed on from Eisenhower.
Yeah, but he was terrified of communism, and despite his concern about how things were going in Vietnam, we talked a little bit in our last episode about Ngo Dinh Diem and his failures as a leader.
Yeah.
like the Buddhist crisis and the famous photo of the monk Quang Duc who set himself on fire, like that landed on JFK's desk. And,
Mhm.
you know, like he's concerned, but he's not concerned about whether or not the US should be there. He just wanted to know whether they were winning.
Yep.
And so heaps of the commanders with a direct line back to Washington were feeding him like overly optimistic
Mhm.
reports
Yeah.
about, you know, how it was going, hoping to please the people above them. And I don't think that was like a conscious decision. I think a lot of that can be traced back to it's a psychological phenomenon called groupthink,
Uh-huh.
where the desire to conform and to be a unit that doesn't have dissenting opinions, that desire is way stronger than the desire to be right or to get a correct answer or make good decisions. And so a lot of suboptimal decisions are sort of made in that context. And I think that's a good example of it. So the ARVN are reporting inflated figures of captured and killed Viet Cong. There were reports of ARVN soldiers like bullying civilians, taking their chickens, and all sorts of property. And
Mate,
ZM,
you can't take a man's chicken.
do not take a man's chicken. Like, you're ripe for anything
It's
if that
worse than
happens.
letting his pants fall down.
Yeah. ZM had specifically instructed ARVN commanders to minimize casualties. And so they just kind of avoided combat.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty good way to minimize your casualties.
Yeah.
A bunch of people have sort of commented on what ZM was doing and saying that objective number 1, keep US aid flowing through Vietnam, South Vietnam.
Mhm.
Objective number
Keep the
2,
money flowing.
yeah, be Catholic.
Yes.
And then, you know, eradicate the Viet Cong was kind of way down his list.
Yeah.
And so based on his instruction to minimize casualties, the ARVN just wandered around super noisily.
Nothing to see here.
I hope no one's hiding around this corner. And
Ding, 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 ding.
yeah, they're like bombarding areas with artillery way before they go into it. So, you know, if anyone's there, if the Viet Cong are there, they're experts at melting away, you know, at the best of times, the
Yeah.
worst of times. And so it's just child's play for them. And all the American officers, advisors,
Yes.
could see all of this. They could see that the Viet Cong controlled the vast majority of the countryside, including heaps of areas that the ARVN were marking as peaceful.
Yeah.
And Frank Walker writes that American Saigon Command did not want to hear any negative reports from its captains, majors, and colonels in the field. Any field officer who tried to get the true situation across to the commanders was slammed as defeatist. The real burden of the war was being carried by local militia who encountered the VC in villages where both sides were struggling for control. Kind of ties back into, you know, Ghost Platoon, which obviously happened later, but that struggle for control and,
Yeah.
you know, this is obviously before all of that unfolds. But early on, there was a struggle, you know, for who was going to be feared the most or loved the most. You mentioned hearts and minds.
Yeah.
So back to Barry. In August of 1963, Barry's 28,
Mm-hmm.
and he hops on a flight to Vietnam, and he knows about as much as the reality of what's happening in Vietnam as JFK does at this point. He'd done a bit of research. He'd read up on Vietnam's history. You know, he loves culture. Like JFK, though, he was a firm believer in the domino theory.
Yes.
He believed communism was evil, had to be stopped, and he was pretty certain of that. He just wasn't certain about what his role was going to be in stopping it at this point. When he arrived in Saigon, he wasn't wearing his combat uniform, though. He was wearing civilian clothes because he didn't really know much about what his role was going to be. He just knew that it was going to require a discreet approach and that it would involve the CIA. But Barry quickly found his feet. Once he gets there, he paid a local rickshaw driver about $100 to become his little personal transport,
Oh, good.
but also to become his eyes and ears and let him know if anyone's snooping around asking questions about this tall white passenger. So it's a good bit of spycraft, and he's put that puzzle piece in place. Once it's done, he's taken by his old mate Healy, who I mentioned earlier, to see the commander of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. And that they're often just called the team. That's how I'll refer to them as well. The team. So Colonel Sarong, I mentioned the first Australian military personnel in Vietnam.
Yeah.
This is the guy. He waltzed in with his sarong in 1962. That's
Nice.
the first Australian military personnel in the country. And Sarong had a really good relationship and like reputation within the CIA. They knew that he was a little bit different in the way that he approached military situations. Like he considered the sociocultural aspect as well.
Gross.
He was, go on.
Americans have never heard of that.
No, I know. It is a little bit unusual.
Shoot first.
Yeah.
Ask questions later.
Yeah. And Sarong worked fairly closely as well with Healy, who was Barry's mate, and Healy's partner, Peter Young. And they'd been working with the CIA's Combined Studies Division. And their job was essentially just to learn as much as they could about the Viet Cong. Like what's happening in terms of them getting supplies north to south. How are they infiltrating their political cadres into the south? Like what's the vector for their propaganda? All this sort of stuff. They'd been spying on the VC for about a year, and they had a pretty good idea of how things were being done. So going back to Sarong's unique ability to consider political, social, cultural factors as well as part of his calculations, he knew that like the Ho Chi Minh Trail was up and running. There's troops, there's supplies. They're flowing relatively freely.
Like State Highway 1, wasn't it?
Yeah, he knows the ARVN were poorly equipped. He knows the leadership is lacking, that they're not really interested in combat in the first place. And he believed that US strategy was kind of mixed at best at this point, but mostly just completely inadequate for the type of warfare that they were going to be engaged in. They didn't know how to fight against guerrilla fighters in the jungle, and that's something that everybody really knows about Vietnam, why they lost the war. That's sort of the easy answer to give.
Yeah.
Is that they'd fought World War I, World War II, and then they tried to apply those.
Hey, everyone's not wearing uniforms.
Yeah.
Can't tell who
What's
the
up
enemy
with
is.
that? My tank is stuck. What do I do? Can I get a tow?
Why isn't everyone lining up in fields in perfect formation?
Yeah, and so America didn't have a grasp of what was happening here and what they really needed to do. But Sarong believed that he might have found someone with the right sort of skill set, the right sort of experience and personality to maybe make a difference.
There's
A certain Barry Peterson, who would become the Tiger Man of Vietnam. So that's kind of it for this episode.
Perfect setup.
Yeah, in our next episode, much like Ted Sarong's going to unleash the Tiger Man on the Viet Cong, we'll unleash Barry's story a little bit more straight into your earballs.
I can't wait.
Yeah, I guess to summarize episode 1, context, we've learned a bit about the Ghost Platoon, your mates.
Yep.
Some of the horrors of war.
Yes.
They all died in war.
Yep.
Took a little bit longer for...
Yeah.
Or whatever the quote was.
Stop breathing.
Stop breathing? Yeah. And so now, Barry's... We've gone back in time a little bit. Barry's there, boots on the ground.
And he's about to...
We know he can't avert all of the horror of the Vietnam War.
He'll give it a crack, though.
But he's going to give it a red-hot crack.
Be it Incan, mate.
Yeah.
Be a sucker to say.
Raw.
Tune in next time for another episode of Pacific Legends
Unleashed.